Hey, welcome back. I'm Carissa, and continuing in my series of my Master Gardener's training is native plants. Today we'll be discussing the whys and the hows of native plants in our gardens. So let's start with the definition of a native plant. Native plants are plants that occur naturally in our regions. And I have a quote from audubon.org. They are the ecological basis upon which life depends, including birds and people. Without them, the insects and birds cannot survive. So plants grown in our specific regions are needed to support birds and insects from our region. So why should we be concerned about native plants, and why should we be adding them to our gardens? Another quote from audubon.org is, unfortunately, most of landscaping plants available in our nurseries are alien species from other countries. These exotic plants not only sever the food web, but also have become invasive pests, outcompeting native species and degrading habitat in remaining natural areas. So each of our regions are so specific. Each of our regions are so specific to the plants that we have, the insects we have, the birds that we have, and the migrating paths of different birds and butterflies. We should be concerned about adding native plants to our yard for those insects and birds. So our presentation was done by someone local to our area. I am in BC, Canada. So I don't think it would be beneficial for me to share my native plants in my area. But there are some North American natives that I will go over that are beneficial to all of us living in this continent. But I think it's very important for us to do our own research. I think there's a lot of resources out there. There's a big movement and a big push to grow a lot more native plants. I think there are more resources out there right now. But here are a few tips if you want to get to know what are plants that are native to your region. So first of all, Google. Maybe it's your province or your state or your city, the region that you live in. There will probably be lists that you can go off of which plants to incorporate into your garden. Another way to do it is to ask at your local nursery. We were encouraged to do this because it not only allows us to see what's available, but it shows those nurseries that people are interested in buying native plants. And I think they might start purchasing from the wholesaler because they are out there, just so that we can have more selection from our native plants. There are a few different resources online. I think Audubon has one, and Bonap, B-O-N-A-P, and there are whole databases that you can search what area you're in, and then it'll come up with plants you can have in your area, and even which birds are attracted to those plants that you might be growing, which I find really interesting. So checking out Audubon and also the National Wildlife Federation. Those two nonprofits have enormous amounts of information on these topics. The last way would be to go for a walk and identify. There are invasive species out there, but there also are a lot of native plants if we go for walks on the trails surrounding our neighborhoods, our cities, and just sort of get in there and observe and explore and sort of see what does grow natively in your landscape. Okay, the why. Why are we wanting to grow native plants? What is our benefit? And like I said, there's a huge movement going on for native plants, and I think we're kind of going back to nature, and that's sort of being reflected in garden designs right now. But if you're not aware, here are some reasons why we should be planting some native plants in our gardens. So they're low maintenance. Typically, once they're established, they do not require a lot of maintaining from us humans, because these plants were designed to thrive in our areas, right? They are, my climate specifically is very dry. The soil is not very fertile. Those plants are already going to be thriving in those conditions. So typically, once they're established, they'll require less maintenance from us. The second benefit would be beauty. We have a misconception of thinking that native plants are boring or dull, or maybe they're all gray, because that sort of speaks to a drought-tolerant plant, gray leaves. But really you can find a lot of different texture and a lot of different color, a lot of different sizes and shapes within your native plants. And within the seasons, it's just amazing to see just the different changes, lots of different colors as the season changes. The third benefit would be that it's healthy. It's not only healthy for us, but it's healthy for the environment. Using native plants, you won't be needing to use pesticides and herbicides because these plants are already going to be wanting to grow in your climate, making it a healthier environment for us to live in. And like I said, it's good for the environment. We're helping the climate. It was told to us that the grassland plants especially are very, very good at sequestering the carbon, more so than a forest plant would. It's something about them storing it in the roots. Grassland plants store the carbon in the roots, And additionally, we can be mowing less because some of these native plants do really well growing a little bit longer and a little bit more wild looking. We will be conserving water. Like I said, these plants are already going to be thriving in our climate. We typically, once they're established, won't be adding supplementary water to these plants, which would save us money and time and even energy. The last benefit that I'm aware of is wildlife. Of course, wildlife is going to benefit from our planting of our native species in our areas. Like I said, the birds and the bees and the butterflies and all the insects are going to benefit from these native plants because they have a symbiotic relationship and they depend on each other greatly. We were also made aware of a term called nativars. Nativars, if you can guess, is a combination of the words native and cultivar. So these are cultivated native plants. They have been bred or selected for their vigor or beauty. So they are not the original species. They are slightly different. And sometimes they can be a little bit more vigorous, like I said. So if self-seeding is a concern for you, maybe stay away from some of the nativars. Another consideration to have when you are growing a nativar is that they are typically, like I said, bred for more beauty. Double petals sometimes come along with that, right? We typically like a little bit more of a fluffier bloom instead of the single bloom, which is more common in the native varieties. So the double bloom would deter a bee or a pollinator from getting inside of that bloom. So it's something to consider, right? And I think there's a lot of push and pull with this topic, right? It doesn't mean we can't have any double petals, but having some double petals in our garden is all right, right? For our own satisfaction and enjoyment, but keeping aware that the single blooms are a little bit easier to pollinate. Even down to colors. If the classic color has been changed, it might affect the pollination and thus produce less food for our pollinators. The last consideration would be to stay away from any other drastic changes. As close as you can to the native plant is probably the best, just so that the pollinator and insects and birds can easily identify and recognize that plant. Another reason why we need to be more aware of what's growing in our area, what's invasive, what's native, what's beneficial, and all those types of things is because invasive species can sometimes trick us into thinking that they are native. Because they are so well established, there's abundant amounts of them around us, we can be sometimes tricked into thinking some invasive species are actually beneficial. So invasive species are anything that has been introduced by a human typically in the last 100 years or less. And these cause harm, ecological, economical, and health impacts. Sometimes pollinators will choose to go to those invasive species because maybe they're a little bit easier to pollinate or they're more readily available. Sometimes it affects their reproduction and it can actually deter some population growth. Another reason would be economical, like I said. There's enormous amounts of money put into pesticides to eradicate some of these invasive species, and it costs a lot of money and it takes a lot of energy to rid ourselves of these in our regions. And just something to make a note of, some of these invasive species might still be sold at our local nurseries. They might be unregulated, which is a concern, right? And that's where it's a good idea to maybe inform yourself and others, and maybe even the store that you're shopping at, that is an invasive species. Being aware of different ingredients in your wildflower seed packets. I think a lot of us tend to gravitate towards those packs because it's nice and easy and you get like a beautiful mixture of different plants, but some of those typically are invasive. So just be aware of some of those blends. And it might be invasive in our area and maybe not our neighboring region. Invasive species are not invasive in every single region. It really depends on your climate and what your growing conditions are. And lastly, familiarize yourself. Like I said, you can do a Google search in most cities and provinces and states, and most regions would have a brochure probably on invasive species just to inform their residents. And then we discuss things like pollinator specificities, which just is a fancy way of saying the specific needs of a pollinator and how those plants coincide with it. So one thing was buzz pollination. Sometimes there are only one specific species of a bee that can pollinate a specific flower. So only they can release that nectar from that plant. So definitely an important consideration. Another one was hidden nectar. So plants like columbine, their nectar is hidden, right? So that tells us that only a specific pollinator can pollinate a columbine plant. Poison pollen. So some bees can tolerate a toxic plant while others can't, right? So do you see how they're very dependent on each other? Deceptive orchids. So there's no pollen in an orchid, rather there's a pollen sac, right? So that tells us that there's a specific pollinator for orchids. host specificity. A lot of us are very familiar with monarchs and milkweed, but something that's not discussed is that the adult monarch and the larvae require different plants. So in our region, we are told to grow swampy milkweed because that produces the pollen needed for monarchs, and that gives them the toxicity so that the predators will stay away from them. But this is just specific for the larvae. An adult monarch can pollinate many, many different things. It's important to remember that we need the whole life cycle of a specific insect, pollinator, bee, and not just the larvae, right? A larvae wants the milkweed, but an adult really wants anything. An adult can use anything, right? So we want to consider the whole life cycle of our pollinators and plant accordingly. So this is a lot of information, and I think it's just to show us how vast and how intricate all of these relationships are within plants and pollinators, right? It's not to overwhelm us, it's just to show us that a diverse landscape is really going to benefit not only us, but also our ecosystem. So speaking of our ecosystem, if we want to be selfish, we can think about, okay, so how do native plants, how do they serve us? What is the benefit to us, right? We've talked about why it benefits our world, but what specifically is a benefit for us when we're planting native plants? So water filtration and retention is a huge consideration, right? Their roots are often deep and they will help us with those things. I've discussed carbon sequestration. They are very great at that. Pest control, if you're bringing in native plants, you're going to be having your native pollinators as well, which will help you with your pests. Erosion control, like I said, the roots facilitate a lot of that. Nutrient cycling. So some of the threats to our ecosystem is habitat loss and invasive species. So those two things are really going to set us back when we're talking about native plants and just creating that thriving ecosystem that is specific to our very region. So what can we do? We've discussed why, and now, or how can we partner in this? Creating a habitat. So in our own yards, doesn't matter if you have a balcony or if you have an acreage, you can create a habitat, right? So assess your site, right? If you only have a spot for a pot, maybe you're just going to choose a few different species and plant that on your balcony. But if you have a whole yard, maybe you want to devote an entire corner of your yard for native plants. So assess your site, see what you're already working with, see what is existing, see what kind of climate and soil you have, see what sort of other restrictions you have, shade or sun, that type of thing. Start thinking about functionality, right? Not all of us will want an entire yard filled with native plants, but for your functionality and your preference, think about what's going to work for you. Because I think, like I said, there's going to be a lot of push and pull with a lot of these topics, right? We can go full steam ahead and just convert our entire yard to a native landscape, but we're not maybe going to love it as much as we would if we had a percentage of native plants and then still sticking with some of our few more exotic plants as well. So when you're looking to source your native plants, take a look at your local nursery. Like I said, even if they're not selling native plants, asking maybe a manager or the owner if they would consider bringing in some native plants is really going to sort of put a vote in, right? When they're doing their buying, they're going to really consider that some people have been asking about native plants, and it'll sort of start maybe a new trend in your city or local garden center. Ask your garden group. Maybe you're part of a garden group. Maybe you can collect seeds off of a friend, or they can divide one of their plants. Talk to some of your gardening friends. Collecting seeds. So in public or private areas, it's still a consideration, right? You need permission, obviously, on a private space, but in a public area, still be wary about collecting seeds, right? We don't want to overburden, over harvest. We want to be mindful about that. I think there's a 10% sort of rule. Don't take more than 10%, and even that is a lot. But also be aware that you're not taking anything invasive, right? And just to close, keeping in mind that native plants are definitely beneficial, but also beneficial plants that are not native, right? An open dahlia is easier to pollinate than a ruffled dahlia. And just kind of keeping those things in mind as you are doing your garden design and planning, just to make sure we're taking care of our native bees and birds and ecosystem. And here's a picture of some of my native to North America, not just specifically in my region. So the top picture, I have Gaillardia. That is a super important plant for our ecosystem, just for pollinators, and even the seed head produces some food. And then beside that is Monarda, and of course that's great for pollinators. You can, anytime you go out in the garden, you'll see a bee or a butterfly on that one. And below we have Solidago, or goldenrod, I believe. I don't actually have this one for my garden yet, but I will be on the hunt for it because it is definitely beneficial and it makes a good cut flower as well. And then beside that is a cosmo. Cosmos are not native to my area, but they are a beneficial plant, right? So I know I'm talking about native plants, but let's just consider all different plants and how they benefit our ecosystems. And then below is yarrow. This is a cultivated variety, but the common yarrow is a native plant in our area, and it's super beneficial, but I also like some of the cultivars as well. And then the last picture is columbine. And I think now knowing that there are specific pollinators just for columbine makes me excited to add more columbine to my yard. And I think sitting back and noticing which birds and bees and pollinators are coming into your yard will really sort of feed your love for all of these native plants too, right? Yeah, typically they are a little bit more simple. They're not as showy sometimes, but I think we will be rewarded when we see all of the life that gets brought into our gardens, and just knowing that we're creating a healthier landscape. So that wraps up my topic on native plants. Again, these are huge topics, and I'm just condensing it into, short videos for you just to show you what I'm learning. I encourage you to do some research on your own, get to know your own region and what specific plants are good for your area. Thank you so much for joining me, and I believe our next topic will be pollinators. So anyway, I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you next time.